panel discussion of the day. The title is Cybersecurity as an Economic Imperative Driving Growth in the Global Economy. Allow me to introduce to you your esteemed speakers. First up, we have Florian Schütz. He is Director of the Federal Office for Cybersecurity in Switzerland. Please welcome him. Next up, we have Heidi Crebo-Rediker. Delighted to see her back again. She is the Senior Fellow for Geoeconomics at the Council of Foreign Relations. Please give her a warm round of applause. Next, we have another returning guest. He is Akshay Joshi, the head of the Center for Cybersecurity at the World Economic Forum, ladies and gentlemen. And completing the lineup, we have Stéphane Straub, the Chief Economist for the Infrastructure Vice Presidency of the World Bank. Nice to see you. And here to lead the discussion, to chair the conversation, please welcome Nisha Pillai, international moderator and journalist.
Thank you so much.
Nice to see you. Welcome back.
What a lovely introduction from Rebecca there. Assalamu alaikum, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to continue this important discussion on the link between cybersecurity and economics. We've just heard that the Center for Cyber Economics has been launched. We just heard from Dr. Al-Saboudi that Saudi Arabia considers cybersecurity to be an essential pillar of the Vision 30 agenda. How do we make this into a reality?
You were the one sending me messages.
That's what we're going to be discussing.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Really
now.
great.
So let's continue. Let's start now. I think we need to turn some of the mics off backstage. Thank you very much. So that we can concentrate on what our esteemed guests have to say. Stéphane Straub from the World Bank. I'd like to start with you, if I may.
Your Excellency, so nice to see you again. How are you?
Reducing cyber incidents could significantly boost GDP per capita. Could you tell us more about how this works? What are the channels through which this works?
Sure. Thank you, Nisha. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So we've been doing some research at the World Bank on this question. We realized there was really not a lot of evidence on this. So we started from the big picture and tried to go down to find a more granular one. So the big picture is like if you look at cross-country evidence and you use some proxy for how countries are prepared to actually deal with cybersecurity issues, we get this estimate that we see as been taken up a lot, a bit everywhere. That by moving from being in the bottom 25% to the top 25%, you could probably increase your per capita GDP by 1.5%, something like that. So obviously there's some issues with the way we estimate this. So we wanted to
That's a very dramatic increase.
Well, let's say it's non-negligible.
Spoken like an economist.
Yeah.
Were you surprised by the results?
Not really, and maybe I'll say why I'm not. But then we tried to understand a bit more granular in the granular way at the sector level. So we started looking at which sectors. So I'm not going to enter into the technical detail, but you can look at which sectors, how sectors are doing in countries where this preparedness for cybersecurity is lower. And then we see that when you compare different set of countries, there are specific set of sectors that suffer more when cybersecurity is weak. And these sectors are typically utilities, mining, manufacturing, where you see that the impact is greater. So that's kind of the big picture. And just to conclude on giving you a little bit of an analogy, as an infrastructure economist, we've done a lot of work on electricity and outages. It's a big problem in many countries still today. And one thing we've seen in our research over the year, and that's a topic that's pretty well understood now, is that in countries where electricity supply is bad, so you have a lot of outages, firms suffer. But what you see is actually they suffer so much that sometimes they're not even there. So what you see is that the distribution of firm changes. So the analogy is like if your cybersecurity environment is really weak, what you're looking at is probably underdevelopment of your digital sector across these sectors that are particularly exposed.
And therefore underdevelopment of your whole economy. Very clearly put, thank you very much. So Florian Schütz, I'd like to ask you, you are the cybersecurity chief, as it were, for the federal government in Switzerland. I'm sure you're convinced by the argument that we've just heard from Stéphane and the World Bank numbers. But what about your colleagues in the finance ministry, in the economics ministry? Do they look at cybersecurity as an essential pillar of the economy?
So I do think everyone understands the importance of cyber. However, I don't think everyone understands the effects on economy of cyber. What do I mean by that? When we look at the early 2000s, late 90s, IT was primarily framed as an economic issue. And then nation state discovered how to use IT and global platforms for force protection, and it became more and more framed under a security policy issue. And I would say we see that shift more and more today. So it's looked at more under a security policy incentive than an economic incentive. Now, I think the two aspects are intertwined. And what I always explain, we need to protect our GDP. And yes, the big attacks, they generate big economic loss. But there are all these little attacks, like little ransomware attacks, that hurt small companies. 75% of Swiss companies earn less than $500,000 a year. If they have a problem, all of them, Switzerland has a problem. And so I think if you play a strategic game in the long run, hurting the economy actually brings you there, and that's why this is super important. So the other aspect is, and with the new strategy we actually implemented that, you shouldn't just look at risk, because then you look at it as an attack-defense game and you lose out on the balance sheet, right? Yeah. You should look at the opportunities. So where can you make investment to actually bring more money into the country, bring more money into the economy and increase GDP?
And more work needs to be done in that field.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Heidi, I'd like to ask you about how financial markets look at all this. So you are a geo-economist. And I was asking Heidi just a minute ago, what is a geo-economist? And it's looking at strategic thinking and economics and finance and bringing it together. So how do financial markets view cyber risk? Do they see it as something which is of financial importance, wider financial importance?
So I think they basically see it as a tail risk that's very hard to quantify. And in the same way that you have these large strategic risks, whether they're geopolitical, whether they're shocks that you would have out of a war that came out of some place that's sort of out of left field, I think that the work that the IMF has done in particular on highlighting the risk to financial stability, particularly the transmission of risk through the financial system. And I think most of the work has really been done on what kind of shocks we could see coming out of financial institutions and therefore through markets, the ability of companies to borrow, for example. And they have flagged that the digitization and the risk for geopolitical conflict has actually heightened the systemic risk, particularly for financial stability. And I think that that's very important.
And do markets see it that way?
And I don't think they do.
Right.
I think that when you have investor surveys, they tend to rank cyber threats near the top, sometimes above inflation or supply chain risk. But when it comes to actually trading in the markets or making investments, it's really hard to think with all of the different things that you're thinking about in making an investment, where cyber threats actually sit on that list of risks, because there are multiple risks out there, and a lot of them are much more short-term rather than long-term.
So let's see if we can help to make that case this morning. Akshay, you're head of the Center of Cybersecurity at the World Economic Forum, soon to be leading the Center of Cyber Economics, I believe. The World Economic Forum has consistently highlighted the cyber risks globally, not just from a financial point of view. So can you step back for us for a minute and give us the big picture? What are we missing here?
It's really, first of all, thank you, and really nice to be back here. I think what's happened over the past years, if we are to reiterate, can be summed up in what we've seen over the past 2 months. We look at a large organization in the UK, like Jaguar Land Rover, that has witnessed a very significant incident. Now, that's looking at some of the economic consequences of cyber at an organizational level. You look at the disruptions that we faced across airports in Europe just a couple of weeks ago. That gives you a sense of the amount of chaos it created, and by extension, certain economic imperatives. And the last one being the most concerning, whereby cybercriminal actors have recently stolen data from nurseries. And this is data associated with children, and to that extent, I say the work that the GCF is doing also around protection of children in cyberspace is very, very important. But if you think about it, we're looking at an organizational lens, we're looking at systemic effects impacting populations, and then we're going down to some really, really sensitive information that has catastrophic consequences. So it's impossible in today's day and age to disassociate the impacts of cyber with our daily lives, and therefore there needs to be a very strong argument. I want to also build on what Heidi was saying. As you think about the geopolitics, as you think about trade, as you think about economic crisis, you need to overlay cyber on each of these phenomena to be able to appreciate the impacts of cyber as a whole. So if you're looking at the geopolitics, as of today, it's well acknowledged that cyber operations are pretty integral. If you look at downturns, there is evidence also, including from law enforcement agencies, that there is an uptick in cybercrime that tends to take place. If you think about strained economic systems, so for example, if you have a food crisis or others, imagine if there are supply chain disruptions in those times. So I just share these to build the argument for why an economics-based approach to cybersecurity is no longer optional, but an imperative.
Excellent. So if indeed cybersecurity weaknesses can lead to cascading systemic risks, what would be the mechanisms through which those risks would be transmitted? Well, one of them would be supply chains, as we just heard from Akshay Joshi. So I would wonder if I could ask you, Stéphane Straub, about what the World Bank is doing to try and work towards equalizing the cyber inequities or the cyber poverty that we see in some countries, which, because of the global economic system, means we're all linked through supply chains.
Yes, so I think we start from the recognition that cybersecurity is a public good. I think that's something that is being said here and is pretty clear. What do I mean by a public good? It's something that, if you leave the private market on its own, the laissez-faire solution, it won't be enough. Firms won't invest enough. Protection won't be high enough. The reason for that is that there are externalities. So what you're saying, shocks, they go through supply chains. They actually there's several reasons why there are externalities. There are technological reasons. There was everybody has heard about the NotPetya attack. It started with a small software firm in Ukraine, and it kind of blocked completely the operation of Maersk, which is one of the biggest trading shipping company in the world. So you have this kind of technological, physical connection, but you also have the market side of it. So competition, firms that are in the same market, trust issues that actually trickle down through these networks. So because of this, there's a need for intervention from governments, intervention from institutions like the World Bank. So that's what we're doing. So we're trying to raise awareness. That's the first thing we do, and build data. I can give you a few data that are actually quite scary. If you look at how much the US is spending versus the whole of Latin America, the US spending 16 times more in cybersecurity than the whole subcontinent, Latin America. If you look at per capita spending by government in the US or Canada, and you compare it to India or Mexico, which are not the poorest country on earth, these are middle-income countries, it's 1 to 30. So you have this really underinvestment situation in countries. And so we're trying to raise awareness and build a community of practice so countries can start investing at the level where they should do. So recently, a couple of weeks ago, we had a workshop in Brazil Brazil is an example of a country that is really taking this question seriously across the whole institutional setting. And it raises different questions, and maybe we'll come to that point. We had this discussion before. It reminds me another analogy of the pharma market, the drug market. Big companies, they invest where the market is. So, they invest in drugs for diseases of the first world, of the rich countries, not for diseases in Africa. And we have a little bit of a similar situation in cyber.
Okay, Stéphane, I just want to ask Heidi her view then. Stéphane is telling us that cybersecurity needs to be viewed as a public good, that there is a case to be made for government intervention. You can't just leave it to the private sector. So that begs the question, what kind of interventions do you think we need to see from governments? Governments and businesses working together, governments working alone to prevent catastrophic failures?
So I look at that question primarily in the context of critical infrastructure, because I think one of the underappreciated risks that we have right now, and this is very much the case in the United States, is that state-based actors, in addition to criminal actors, but the state-based ones are really the more sophisticated and the ones that are more prone to acting in a geopolitical manner. And these are in complex systems. They're throughout our electricity grids, our water utilities, transportation, ports, airports, satellite communications. And we know in the United States these have been compromised by state-based actors. And so when you look at both public and private ownership of those assets, sometimes you have a poorer part of the United States where you have a state or local government that owns that piece of infrastructure and doesn't have the money to invest in it, which means that you get to this weakest link in your infrastructure. And I think it's a massive risk. I go back to what the World Bank does on infrastructure, looking at cyber risk through the lens of critical weather events or catastrophic events that have wiped out critical infrastructure and what that means. If you don't have that infrastructure, it's not as catastrophic. If you're highly connected, if your infrastructure is getting increasingly dominated by interconnectivity, use of AI, software, all of that building in for efficiency is also building in for vulnerabilities. And the only way that we can address those kind of massive catastrophic attacks is having both public and private working very, very closely together, because this is an enormous amount of money that needs to be invested still in places like the United States in order to bring our critical infrastructure up to some kind of level of security where we don't have a potential attack that could wipe out agriculture, healthcare, and think about semiconductor fabs that require electricity, ongoing electricity and water. Otherwise, they have enormous damage done to them. So that's just sort of like an example. But
I just want to bring Akshay Joshi in. Your work at the World Economic Forum, a lot of it is facilitating public-private partnerships, the sort of thing Heidi's just been talking about. Can you tell us what works and what doesn't work in this particular area of trying to minimize cyber risk transmission?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, what works? Where there is the willingness, right? So the willingness is really important. Let me pick, because we're in Riyadh, let's pick the example of the private sector and the National Cybersecurity Authority that are working very closely together. Third-party risk management, you were alluding to supply chain risk management as one of the really big challenges. Aramco's been working with us for several years now as part of an oil and gas working group on cyber resilience. Over a period of time, they worked within the kingdom to develop some really good third-party risk management practices, something that they call a CCC framework. Over a period of time, under the leadership of the National Cybersecurity Authority, this has been extended across various organizations in the kingdom. Now, think about...
So a top-down approach works?
I think it's a bottom-up and a top-down, because some of the approaches, the creation has been done, but then the willingness of the government to come on board and then see how you can scale these approaches is what makes it paramount,
and
right?
briefly, what doesn't work?
So what doesn't work is where the incentives are misaligned. And we were talking with Stéphane previously, you know, I mean, if you think about an infrastructure project where, for example, you're going to build roads in a particular country, the private sector comes in, they develop the road, the government has an interest in terms of the road being developed, the private sector operates, collects toll on it for a period of 15 years or something like that. You have incentives in place for every actor. The government gets a really nice highway, and the private sector is able to get a defined ROI. In the case of cyber, when you think about public-private cooperation, let's just say that the incentives are not as clear in terms of how each actor can benefit from the cooperation.
Yeah, that's a very nice example. Thanks, Akshay. So I'm going to put a tricky question to you now, Florian Schütz. There's a lot of discussion here about the need for government intervention, but what shape should it take, ladies and gentlemen? In the UK, Jaguar Land Rover, the example Akshay mentioned earlier, big car company, has been unable to produce for 1 month. And reluctantly, the government has been dragged into getting involved against its will. And it's offered on Saturday loan guarantees. But it's an unpopular, controversial decision. So what are your thoughts on this?
So I can just tell you how we do it in Switzerland, and every country has to find the approach that matches them. We still believe companies are ultimately responsible for their own security, so are citizens. However, we as a government, we provide the framework that they can use, and we need to make cyber risk transparent so they can choose their risk appetite and ensure they do not go over that. One tool that we see used across the globe is regulation, but that's just one policy-making tool, and yes, we have regulation to hinder too big damage. But for example, with the financial sector, we set up a financial sector cybersecurity center. This is funded by the financial sector. It's an association where the banks and insurers are members, and we integrate them into crisis management processes from our government. We did the same with the healthcare sector. So we share the burden, we share the investments. They have access to the data that we have about their sector. They have access to our resources. They have access to privileged insights, and we gain access through them into their business, because I don't know what happens if we switch a server in a bank off. Does that impact the stock exchange or doesn't it? The financial sector people do. We know how to deal with the malware. And I think that's the kind of collaboration you need to set up, and not only think regulation.
So still a bit of reluctance to take a very active role in this, I guess because there's concern about freeloaders in a system like this. So we've got 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes left, dear panelists. I'd like to ask each of you to answer me in one sentence. What is it going to take to change this paradigm so that cybersecurity is seen as a public good, as essential as water or education? Heidi.
So I'd like to think that there's one thing. I'm afraid that we only react collectively if there is some massive incident. And we've seen that in many different, not just cyber, but in many different areas, geopolitical, financial, what have you. But I think that the imperative is to actually, I think, have the conversations that this cyber, the cyber economics, and looking at the sort of elevating this as a macro issue, and getting more people involved in the conversation outside of just the cyber silo.
Yes,
because
indeed.
it's technical. People tend to think of it in sort of a part of the back office rather than the CEO or the C-suite, and not in the broader sense of what
Keep talking cyber economics. Stéphane Straub,
exactly.
One sentence.
So I think we need more data, definitely, and I think this type of event where people meet and discuss and try to think of new issues is really important. But I would say, I mean, let's think of building on what you're saying. Let's think of this as a bit like we work on disaster preparedness. Mm-hmm. So now we have a whole unit at the World Bank, for example, where working with countries, making them more resilient to natural disasters in the context of climate change. And I think, and so we're thinking about avoided loss as an economic gain. And I think we need to have this approach and understand that it's actually a gain that we
avoided loss is an economic gain. Thank you,
It's definitely
Stéphane.
an economic gain. Yeah.
Florian.
A macroeconomic theory on cyber, looking at opportunities as well as at risks.
Okay, you have to create a whole macro theory where you position cyber as an opportunity, and we're not doing that enough. Okay, thank you. That's short and sweet. I'm going to give you the final word, Akshay. You're launching the Center for Cyber Economics.
No, thank you very much. I think this has been a fascinating discussion, and all my colleagues have shared some of the most important imperatives, but I want to pick on something that Florian said just as we came into the session, right? So across the board, the importance of cyber is understood, yet you said that the effects are not understood. And that's where I have hope. The Center for Cyber Economics, if it is able to translate some of these fears into a concrete understanding of what are the priority actions and the economic consequences of inaction.
Priority actions?
Correct.
Consequences.
Correct. And that's what is going to be really, really powerful. So we also equally need to look at safeguarding against value erosion, but equally thinking about value creation. If we invest in cyber, what does it do for job creation? What does it do for resilience and the kind of economic growth uptick that you mentioned? So I think there's a lot we can do.
A positive story.
Correct.
Growth, jobs. What did Stéphane say? Loss is a gain. Avoiding losses is a gain. What did we hear from Florian? Opportunity, opportunity, opportunity. Create a macroeconomic framework. And what did we hear from Heidi? Put it out there. Talk about cyber economics. Make cyber economics a word that everyone understands. I've learned so much from this discussion, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I do hope you have too. Let's put our hands together to say thank you very much to our panelists.